Catholic History Trek, a podcast exploring the Catholic past.
Welcome to another episode of the podcast Catholic History Trek. I'm Scott Scholze, and I'm joined again by my esteemed co-host Kevin Schmeezing. In this trek, we are going to boldly go where no Catholic podcast has gone before, rural Ohio. At least I assume no Catholic history podcast has gone to rural Ohio. Regardless, we will trek through the Ohio Scenic Byway, which cuts through western Ohio, and discover some of the treasures in the land of the cross-tip churches. To give a little history of that area, about 250 years ago, west central Ohio was a flat forested region speckled with many swampy marshes and inhabited by Indian tribes, such as the native Miami and others who had been pushed west by European immigration. By the end of the 18th century, Fort Laramie and Fort Recovery had been built in the area, and the American forces under Mad Anthony Wayne had won the Battle of Fallen Timbers, defeating the Western Confederacy of Native Americans led by notables such as Blue Jacket and Little Turtle. This U.S. victory led to the signing of the Greenville Treaty and opened the area for official settling, although intrepid pioneers had already been venturing into this previously Indian-controlled territory. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Americans had won another victory in the War of 1812, and the area saw even more expansion. And by the mid-1800s, counties were established in the area, and throughout the 1800s, a wave of immigrants, predominantly from northwestern Germany, sailed into New York Harbor, traveled west to Cincinnati, and ventured north into west central Ohio, immigrating to places like Stollerstown and Petersburg. These immigrants established little settlements and villages, and in each one built beautiful Catholic churches, with the assistance of architects and builders who had also immigrated from Germany. The proliferation of these Catholic churches, each adorned with a cross atop the steeple, in a sparsely populated area where the livestock greatly outnumbered humans, gave rise to what is now called the land of the cross-tip churches. In all, the land of the cross-tip churches consists of over 30 churches, including a relic shrine and former seminary and former convents. The vast majority of these churches reside in Mercer County, with the remainder in Auglaize, Darke, and Shelby counties, and even one church residing just 2 miles across the state border in Indiana. The oldest churches in the region were constructed in the 1830s in Stollerstown, which is now called Minster, in Mariastein, and in Petersburg, which is now defunct and replaced by churches in nearby Freiburg, Rheine, and Botkins. These original pioneer log churches no longer exist, having been replaced over a century ago by newer structures, some of which still stand today. The oldest still standing churches are St. Augustine, erected in Minster in 1849, and St. John and Freiburg dating to 1850. The remaining cross-tip churches that still exist today were built from the 1850s into the beginning of the 20th century. And to give us more on the history regarding the Catholic faith in this region, I'll turn things over to Kevin.
Well, thank you, Scott. So boldly going where no Catholic has gone before. I don't know. We might be traversing onto copyright ground there. I don't know, but if we have some lawyers call us, we'll just refer them to our legal department. That does remind me, though. I was thinking about this. If I don't know if we have any followers, but if we ever do have followers, I'm thinking we could call them trekkers. Because obviously it's tempting to call them Trekkies, but again, I'm worried about copyright issues, trademark issues. So I think if we go with Trekkers, we're okay. Does that sound all right to you?
I think that sounds like a good idea. Perhaps we'll have to come up with an official Catholic History Trek uniform, for all these trekkers to wear at our conventions.
Yeah, that's a great idea. T-shirts and mugs right around the corner. Okay, back on topic. So two of these cross-tip churches, steeples, are in the small town of Mariastein. Scott, you already mentioned that spot. One of those is the parish church of St. John the Baptist. The other is the relic shrine, in which are housed more than 1,000 relics. That makes it the second largest collection in the United States. And in case you're wondering, the largest collection is in a chapel in Pittsburgh. So the question is, how did these relics get there into rural Western Ohio? I'm starting the story back in 1815 in Rome. St. Gaspar del Buffalo founded a new order, the Missionaries of the Precious Blood. During a visit to Rome a little later, a widow from the German-speaking part of Switzerland, Maria Brunner, met St. Gaspar, was won over to his devotion to the precious blood of Christ, and she founded the female side of the congregation, the Sisters of the Precious Blood. Maria had a son, his name Francis, who had been, I guess you could say, floundering somewhat in his vocation. He had started as a Benedictine monk, then moved to a Trappist monastery, another wing of the Benedictine order, and then became a missionary affiliated directly with the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. At this point, he became the chaplain to the Precious Blood Sisters, which were overseen by his mother. After his mother Maria's death in 1836, Francis decided to join the Precious Blood Fathers himself. In the meantime, there had been substantial German Catholic immigration to the United States in the early 19th century, as Scott already mentioned. By the 1840s, a large number of these German Catholics were in the Diocese of Cincinnati. They were in the city itself, but they were also in the rural areas to the north and the west, this area that Scott had been describing, that had been gradually opened to settlement through Indian removal and improved transportation. So, the Diocese of Cincinnati was desperate for German-speaking priests in particular because most of the priests in the United States at this time were of either Irish or French descent. So in 1843, Bishop John Baptist Purcell invited the Precious Blood Fathers to his diocese to serve this German-speaking population. Francis Brunner had already felt a call to minister in America, and so he readily agreed to this invitation. And late in that same year, 1843, 7 seminarians and 8 priests, including Father Francis Brunner, set out for Cincinnati. It so happened that Bishop Purcell, was on the same ship. They encountered a storm off the coast of France, and they feared for their lives. The storm was that bad. Father Brunner took out an image of Our Lady that he had with him, and he prayed to her intercession, and the storm calmed. And so both he and Bishop Purcell attributed their safe passage to the U.S. to the Blessed Mother's intercession. The image that Brunner had been given to him by the monks of his former monastery in Switzerland. That monastery and the image were both known as Our Lady of the Rock, in German, Maria Stein. The Precious Blood Fathers were eventually given management of more than 20 rural parishes in this part of Ohio, including St. John's in the town of Maria Stein. In 1845, Brunner built nearby what would eventually become the mother house of the Precious Blood Sisters, and in the chapel there, Brunner placed his sizable collection of relics that he had personally collected. Now, fast forward a couple of decades to the 1860s. There's turmoil in Rome as revolutions in Italy and Italian unification are underway. The Pope will lose control of the Papal States. During this period, the churches of Rome were subject to desecration and plunder. And so a lot of their valuables, their treasures were looted, taken away, lost. Among those were relics of the saints, many of them centuries old. A Milwaukee priest who was in Rome in the early 1870s saw this problem, and he began trying to recover these relics. He bought a number of them from pawn shops. He was given others by priests and Vatican officials who wanted them to go somewhere for safekeeping. He ended up with almost 200 relics from these churches of Rome. And then when he came back to the United States, he began looking for a place to keep them safe. He was unsure about cities. American cities had been sites of anti-Catholic violence in the mid-19th century. And as he continued searching, he learned about Father Brunner's relic collection. So this was in heavily Catholic Western Ohio, far from any major city. In this priest's eyes, it was the perfect location. His trove was added to the Maria Stein collection, and this collection, at that point, well on its way to becoming what it is today, the second largest collection in the United States, one of the largest in the world. In 1892, a new relic chapel was built. That's the chapel you'll see there today if you visit the shrine and relic chapel. The Precious Blood Sisters, their numbers have declined over the last few decades, so the Maria Stein Shrine is no longer a convent. It was recently given over to control of a lay board of trustees. They've done a great job with it. They're dedicated to preserving the character of the shrine and the grounds. And so I think it's in the foreseeable future, its future is pretty much assured. This relic chapel in Maria Stein is but one, probably the most remarkable, of the cross-tip churches that you can find dotting the landscape of rural Ohio.
One thing you mentioned, which surprised me a little, was isn't the buying and selling of relics forbidden by the church?
I think the sale and the buying of relics is forbidden, but given that he was recovering them from a pawn shop, I'm guessing, I don't know the details on that, but I'm going to assume that would be a legitimate way to acquire them because there's no other way to get them out of the pawn shop. He's restoring them to the status that they should have had, and if the only way to do that is to pay the pawn shop, then I would guess that that's legitimate. Good question, but that's my guess as to an answer.
Kevin, you mentioned visiting the Relic Chapel, and if one would like to pay a visit to the chapel, the state of Ohio has 27 designated byways, which, per the state's description, are gateways to cultural, historic, natural, scenic, and recreational areas across the state. One of these Ohio byways is called the Land of the Cross-Tip Churches Byway, which is a 38-mile-long stretch of road running through Shelby, Auglaize, and Mercer counties. The byway starts in McCartyville, heading west along State Route 119 and going through Minster and St. Henry, before turning north onto State Route 49 in Fort Recovery and ending at the intersection of State Route 29. And I believe the byway takes you directly past 8 of the more than 30 historic churches and rectories, but you can spot most of the remaining churches in the distance without leaving the byway. If you have never driven the byway, it's a pretty nice drive, unless there's snow on the road. The roads are pretty straight, pretty flat, and aside from the occasional tractor, the minimal traffic moves very easily. The naturally flat geography makes it easy to spot many of the churches from your vehicle, and the only encumbrances to your viewing would likely be the few woods that have not been turned into farmland, and possibly corn in some spots if you're driving during the summer or fall. It's very easy to spot a handful of the church steeples at any one time, given their high concentration and lack of obstructions. I think the most I've probably seen from one spot while driving in the area is perhaps 4 of them, but I'm sure there are people who know the best locations to spot even more of them. And obviously, if you are, up in a choir loft or a second story building or up in a barn, you might be able to see more than you can see from ground level in your vehicle. If you are making a visit, you'll know you're approaching the land of the cross-tip churches when you start seeing Marian grotto statues adorning every other home, and you start to spot large light-up rosaries on the side of many of the barns dotting the landscape. And if you pass through a small village that consists of little more than a Catholic church on one corner and a bar on the other corner, well, you're in the right spot. Also, one of my favorite things about the churches in this area is that many of them have retained their original interior beauty and managed to escape the uglification, which beset many Catholic sanctuaries following the Second Vatican Council. So if you do live in Ohio, or you're just passing through, the Land of the Cross-Tip Churches with the churches and the Relic Chapel are certainly worth a visit. And speaking of visiting, we are now visiting the end of our podcast, where Kevin and I typically will end our episode with the Glory Be prayer, prayed in the church's historic language of Latin. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, sic ut erat in principio nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.